So a couple of years ago, they announced that they were doing a comic book series sequel to American Psycho. And American Psycho is one of my favorite movies. I think it's great, and I think the original book is great, and I think it makes some really interesting and insightful points about society and consumerism and all these different things. The original book by Bret Easton Ellis is supremely violent and disturbing. It has some of the most disgusting scenes I have ever read. And it's written from the first person, and so you are put into the mind of the character Patrick Bateman, the star of the book. Patrick Bateman is a yuppie in the 1980s. He's a very high-class guy, and he's very competitive. It feels like at this point, Patrick Bateman is known less for being the main character of American Psycho and more for just being the Sigma male guy. People will take pictures of Christian Bale playing him, and then they'll just put some kind of pseudo-inspirational crap on there. The text will often say stuff about focusing on your grind or not talking to women, stuff like that. The book serves as a criticism of consumerism and materialism and a lot of stuff like that, and so as a result, Patrick Bateman doesn't see people as people, he sees them as objects more than anything else. Or rather, he doesn't see them as objects, he only sees their objects. Patrick Bateman values people on whether or not they are able to gain access to certain restaurants, or their clothing style, or their business card. Essentially, in the book, Patrick and all those around him only see the external shells of everyone. They don't care about what's on the inside, they don't care about the internal beliefs of a person. They don't care about whether or not their actions match up with their beliefs. And Patrick says as much in the movie.
He presents himself as this harmless old codger, but inside doesn't matter.
And so the book is a very violent, disgusting, dark comedy that is mocking and criticizing and satirizing the 80s. And specifically, it is satirizing that yuppie, high-end New York class. Throughout the book, also, Patrick Bateman kills a lot of people. He murders people, he does disgusting things. Patrick Bateman, in addition to killing people, he also tortures people, he engages in cannibalism and necrophilia, and he's really just a disgusting human being. But of course, within the context of the story, Patrick Bateman is seen as a normal guy because that's the appearance that he puts on. And in both the book and the film, whenever he tries to confess his murders, whenever he feels some kind of guilt or remorse, whenever he tells people exactly what happened, they don't believe him. And not only do people not necessarily believe him, they don't even really know him, often confusing him for Marcus Halberstram or Paul Allen or a number of other people. And that's the way the entire story is, basically. People just confuse other people for one another. And again, the reason why they're doing that is because it doesn't really matter what someone is like on the inside, it just matters what they're wearing, what they're listening to, whether or not they can get a reservation at Dorsia. Basically, American Psycho serves as a critique of vanity and consumerism, materialism, capitalism, all these different things. And so as I'm saying, American Psycho, the book, comes together and it forms this really disgusting depiction of the late 1980s. And one of my favorite aspects of American Psycho is the unreliable narrator aspect. Basically, in both the book and the movie, starring Christian Bale, of course, you don't really know how much of it is real and how much of it isn't. You don't know if Patrick Bateman is actually committing a series of murders across New York or whether or not he's simply imagining it. Both in the book and in the movie, it's very confusing, intentionally so. For instance, Patrick Bateman murders the character of Paul Allen, or Paul Owen in the book, and whenever he tries to confess the murder, people say that they saw Paul walking around in London. And at one point, whenever he returns to the apartment where the murder has taken place, he finds that the apartment is completely clean and he doesn't have to clean it up. So that scene is often interpreted as being that the landlord cleaned up the mess, but you can also interpret that scene as simply nothing happened there, and it was all in Patrick's head. And really the question, I think, of how much of American Psycho actually took place is a very interesting one, and I think it's kind of the core of the book. Patrick Bateman is an unreliable narrator, and so as a result, you don't know. There was an English class that I was in some years back, and we were talking about unreliable narrators, and I was asked to give an example of an unreliable narrator in fiction, and so I basically just shared everything I just said. I shared the idea that you don't actually know how much of American Psycho is real and how much of it is not. And my professor said something to the extent that actually none of the murders took place, none of it's real. But I don't agree with that, and I don't think that's right. And that's something that Bret Easton Ellis, the author of the original book, has talked about. Basically, even he doesn't know how much of it is being made up and how much of it is fake. And so within the context of the original book, as you're reading the book, it's just super unclear how much of it is real, as I keep on saying. With the movie, it's not done quite as well, I think. Because really, with the movie, there are some weird things, but it's not really up until the very end of the movie, whenever he starts being told to feed a cat to an ATM, or whenever Patrick Bateman fires his gun at a cop car and it explodes. It's really only those moments where you start to question how much of it is real. But still, I think that the movie is great, and I think the book is great. I prefer the movie to the book simply because of the fact that the book is so disgusting and gross and disturbing. In the movie, despite the fact that it is violent, it's a lot more subtle than the book. And so as a result, I think it works better because of that. And so American Psycho is a book and a movie that I really appreciate. I think it's great. I think both the film and the book are imperfect, but at the same time, I really like them a lot. And so throughout the years, there have been a lot of questions brought up as to whether or not there would be an American Psycho sequel. They made a sequel to the movie that was direct to DVD. I haven't seen it, I've just heard it's garbage, so I'm not gonna watch that crap, honestly. If you've seen it, let me know how it is. I've heard it's bad. And honestly, I have no trouble believing that a movie sequel to American Psycho is bad. Just because I don't think most people really get it. I don't think that most people really understand the work at the level that I just explained. I think it's really easy to look at the movie and to look at the book and to go, oh man, this guy's crazy. But as I've talked about before, I don't think most people really understand surrealism, which is fair because it's weird. And that's the entire point of surrealism, is it's weird. And so I like a lot of the memes featuring Patrick Bateman. I think they're funny and silly. But much like Silent Hill, I think that American Psycho is one of those things that is really difficult to get right. Like they say, you can never return home, and so as a result, I think that's one of the reasons why we've never gotten an American Psycho sequel. Both the film and the book take place in the 1980s, and the reason why is because the book came out in 1991, and so whenever it was written, it was a contemporary work of fiction. And so whenever the movie was adapted in the year 2000, and whenever it actually dropped, it just kept the 1980s setting. And the reason why is because the 1980s setting is very important to the plot of the book, or rather, maybe not the plot, but it's important to the aesthetics of the book. The book is satirizing one specific period in time and one specific group of people. And Patrick Bateman, of course, as you see in the movies, he loves Huey Lewis in the News and Diana Ross, and he loves all these other 80s pop stars. And I don't remember if it's in the movie so much, but in the book, he loves Donald Trump, and he looks up to Trump, and all of his friends look up to Trump. And you always sort of get the vibe that like Trump is the ideal that Patrick Bateman is trying to reach. But because of the fact that the book is set in the 80s, I've always wondered what an American Psycho sequel would look like if it were set in our modern time. At one point, I believe that FX wanted to do a sequel starring Christian Bale that was a sequel to the movie. Bret Easton Ellis went on Twitter some years ago and he talked about the fact that, I think it was in 2015, 2016 he wrote this. Basically, he said that Patrick Bateman would love Katy Perry and he would love Donald Trump. Still, he would love Trump. And so the idea of bringing Patrick Bateman to the present has always been something that's intrigued me. And even though American Psycho is like a fairly weird franchise and it's a weird idea, basically being like, yeah, you don't know what's real and what's not. Even though it's really hard to build off that, I've always felt that the potential for a high reward for bringing Patrick Bateman to the future, or not even necessarily the future, like of just doing a sequel set in the 90s even. I've always felt that there's a lot of room for richness there. I've always felt that you could do something big with that. And so whenever I heard that they were doing a comic book sequel to American Psycho, I was interested. I can't say I was excited because typically speaking, I think that whenever they do comic book sequels to popular movies or books or whatever, typically they just kind of do comics because they're cheap. And so as a result, most times the material isn't that great. But nevertheless, I was still intrigued by the idea of an American Psycho sequel. And so I wanted to talk about it today. Is the comic book series good? I mean, it's interesting, but all in all, as I read the comic book series, I can't help but feel that the comic book series didn't really understand what makes American Psycho special. You see, the comic book feels like it's lacking just about everything that I talked about earlier that makes American Psycho special to me. It's lacking the dark comedy, it's lacking the satire, it's lacking the critique of any kind of culture or consumerism or materialism or whatever else. It doesn't have that same sort of schizophrenic confusion that the book has. It just doesn't feel deranged like the source material, and it feels like they took everything in the movie literally and just tried to make a sequel that way. Which, if you ask me, just taking the events of the movie literally is the least interesting thing you could have done for a sequel. Fortunately, there are some twists in the comic that we'll get into in a second that make the comic book a kind of interesting read, honestly. It feels like fan fiction in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's interesting fan fiction, so there's that. But really, it feels like the comic book American Psycho is striving to bridge 1987 and then 2011, whenever the book is set. I don't know why they set the comic book in 2011 as opposed to 2024, which is when the comic actually came out, because nothing all that interesting is really done with the setting of 2011. One of the major plot points does involve social media, but really social media is around now, so it's like, it is one of those things where there is a 13-year gap between when the movie is set and when it actually came out. And so the year 2011, if you look at it, there is a 13-year gap between whenever the comic book came out in that year. And so I don't know if they were just trying to do that, but either way, it feels weird. So basically, the American Psycho comic is kind of a retelling of the movie, while also trying to tell you the story of Patrick Bateman's daughter. You see, right off the bat, the American Psycho comic does something really interesting, which is it takes Willem Dafoe's character, Kimball, the detective, and it twists him. Willem Dafoe doesn't have too many scenes in the original movie. I think he only talks to Patrick Bateman a couple times, and he only starts talking to Bateman whenever he's investigating the disappearance of Paul Allen. And really, that's why Willem Dafoe's character, Kimball, appears in Patrick Bateman's life. And so, of course, Kimball, the detective, comes and investigates Patrick Bateman. And so far as I can remember, we're not given any reason to believe that Kimball isn't who he says he is. We're not given any reason to believe that Kimball isn't a detective. But this comic essentially takes the character of Kimball and it twists him. In the comic, Kimball is no longer a detective, he's somewhat of a voyeur. He sees Patrick Bateman and he stalks him and he witnesses all the murders that Patrick Bateman is committing, and he essentially becomes an obsessive fan. And after seeing Patrick Bateman commit some murders, that's when Kimball feels that he has to meet Patrick Bateman. You see, Kimball is shown to love Patrick Bateman, basically, and he almost worships him like a god. And so a lot of the comic is actually spent just showing Kimball witnessing events that took place in the movie. And you always hit the point of diminishing returns whenever you're just replaying previous events, whenever you're showing flashbacks that you've already seen. Essentially, whenever you do something like that, it's never gonna have the same impact of the first time you saw it. And so as a result, seeing the scene where Paul Allen is murdered is kind of lame. It's like, I've seen this before. It feels like between the book and the movie, this is the third time I'm witnessing the murder of Paul Allen. And so that is one thing that I don't really like about the comic, just the fact that it strives to retell sections of the movie. And make no mistake, this comic is very much a sequel to the movie, not so much to the book. You see, the book actually takes place in 1989 and the movie takes place in 1987, so there's a 2-year gap between the movie and the book. I don't know why this happened, but anyway, the movie's set in 1989 and that's when the comic is set. But really, yeah, Willem Dafoe's character Kimball just witnesses Patrick Bateman committing all these murders. And at the same time in 2011, there's a character, Charlie, who is Patrick Bateman's daughter. And you don't know this at first, but at the same time, it's like, you kind of figure it, you know, because who else is she gonna be? But basically, whenever you're introduced to Charlie, she's at a club, and a guy takes her to the bathroom, and they start making out and stuff, and then she's like, no, stop, don't rape me, basically. And she has this violent fantasy of killing him, which she doesn't actually do, but instead she throws up on him, and then he cusses her out and then leaves. The next morning, though, the would-be rapist is found dead, and Charlie finds herself covered in blood, and so she starts asking all these questions like, did I commit the murder? Did I actually go into some sort of fugue state and murder him that way? And that's kind of what it looks like, but then you as the reader, you know that's not the case because you're shown someone killing the guy, so you know it's not Charlie. And then Charlie finds out that someone made a social media profile. They made a Twitter account for her, basically where she's just talking about murder. And it has her profile picture and everything, and so it looks like she's the one doing it. And of course she's like, oh man, did I actually do this? Did I go into some kind of, somnambulous fugue state or something where I'm just tweeting in my sleep? And it's kind of a silly idea, but essentially Charlie has one thing up on Patrick Bateman, which is that, she's not a psycho, she feels empathy, and she actually feels some degree of remorse, and she's scared that she actually did commit a murder. In essence, she's a normal person. And so because of the fact that Charlie is having these violent fantasies and she's unsure of what's real and what's not, she ends up going to her parents. And her dad is the guy who's implied to be gay, who's in love with Patrick Bateman, and Patrick goes to strangle him in the bathroom, and then Lewis is the guy's name, he kisses Patrick's hand, and then that scares Patrick off so much that he leaves. Anyways, so that gay guy is her dad, but not really. It turns out Patrick's her real dad. And it's revealed that Patrick Bateman has actually been in a mental institution for many years. And so then Charlie goes to the mental institution, where it turns out that Patrick checked himself in willingly, and he basically tells Charlie why exactly he is in a mental institution. As I was saying, in the comic, Kimball is revealed to be this sort of fan and admirer of Patrick Bateman. And there's a scene in the movie that is replayed in the book, in the comic that is, where Patrick goes to kill his assistant Jean, but he ends up letting her go. And the reason why is because she's kind of sweet, she's pure. She's a nice girl and she hasn't done anything wrong. She's always kind to him, basically. And so he can't kill her. But at a certain point, whenever Patrick Bateman is out of the office, Kimball comes over, he kills Jean, Patrick Bateman's assistant, and then that's kind of when he outs himself to Patrick Bateman, and he's like, I love you, I'm your admirer, And basically, Kimball just wants Patrick Bateman to be a murderer because, again, he worships Patrick Bateman. He sees Patrick Bateman as this god, and so he's like, please go and continue your murder spree. Then Kimball calls the police and he confesses to all the murders that Patrick Bateman did, and then he runs away, basically. And Patrick Bateman tells his daughter, Charlie, that Kimball, is a murderer, of course. He's been a murderer for the last 2 decades at this point in the comic. And that was the reason why Patrick Bateman checked himself into a mental institution, was because Kimball killed Jean, Patrick's assistant. And it's kind of weird. It feels like not very good logic, honestly. And one thing I don't like about this comic series is that because of the fact that Kimball is kind of retconned to be watching Patrick Bateman anytime he commits a murder, it's revealed that everything that you thought was Patrick going crazy, it was actually Kimball going in behind the scenes and fixing it. And what I mean by that is, do you remember that scene I mentioned earlier where Patrick's going to an apartment and he's there to clean up the blood and the body and the murder he committed, but then he finds out that the apartment is actually clean? Whenever that happens in the movie, you're supposed to think, oh man, did it actually happen? Did he actually murder someone? Or did he murder someone and the landlady just cleaned it up because she didn't want the property value to go down? And so there's this ambiguity in there. But then the comic series retconned it to where it's like, oh no, Kimball just went in behind the scenes and cleaned up Patrick Bateman's mess. And it kind of does that for everything else in the movie. Any instance where it's like Patrick Bateman is crazy, it kind of sweeps that under the rug a little bit. And I don't like that. I don't like the fact that the ambiguity is kind of gotten rid of through this comic, because it makes the entire work feel a lot less interesting, honestly. But nevertheless, that's what the comic series did. And so as I said, Patrick Bateman is talking to Charlie and he tells his daughter all of this. And Charlie, of course, is just a normal girl. She sometimes has violent fantasies, but honestly, if that's your worst characteristic, then you're not that bad, I feel. I don't know, maybe I'm a psycho for thinking that, but thinking about murdering a rapist is there were worse things you could do. And so Charlie is disturbed because she feels like she has these violent fantasies, but she hasn't acted any of them out. She doesn't kill anyone. And so then you learn that the entire time Patrick has been in a mental institution, Kimball's just been out murdering people. And Kimball writes a letter to Patrick Bateman where he says oh yeah, I want you to become a monster again. I want you to start murdering people, which is why I fell in love with you in the first place. And so as a result, I'm going to murder your daughter to try to whip you back into shape. Basically, Kimball's entire grand plan and his framing of Charlie for the murder of the rapist and stuff like that is kind of silly, I think. He says that his plan was to frame Charlie in a murder-suicide to lure you out of your self-imposed prison. He's talking to Patrick Bateman. And so Patrick Bateman realizes that Kimball is going to kill his daughter, and so Patrick Bateman snaps and he kills the people who are hanging out at the mental institution. Hanging out is not the right way to describe it. He kills the receptionist, who's doing her job. And he hops into his car and then he drives to Charlie's place. And so the final showdown of the comic is basically that Kimball shows up at Charlie's place and then they get into a fight because he's trying to kill her and she defends herself, and then Patrick Bateman shows up at the scene. But whenever he's lying on the floor dying, Kimball tells Patrick Bateman that Patrick is his god. And so there is a little bit of confusion at first because it looks like Patrick Bateman picked up Charlie, his daughter, and you think he's taking her to the ER, but then it turns out that she's just kind of imagining that, because what he actually did was he picked up Kimball and he took him to the ER. Charlie realizes that Patrick Bateman left her and he took care of Kimball, not her, but she says that she doesn't need Patrick Bateman. And so that's basically where the comic ends. That's how everything comes together. I think that it's really cool to be able to see what Patrick Bateman was up to in 2011. I think that's a cool idea. I like the idea that whenever he shows up, he's wearing a Hawaiian shirt and he's smoking a cigar, because that feels pretty in character, if I'm being honest. And so really, in the end, this comic is weird. It's kind of strange. And the reason it's strange is because, as I said, it takes a very literal view of the movie. It doesn't try to do anything with the larger themes of the movie or the book, and it literally just takes the characters and it runs with them. And your enjoyment of the comic depends entirely on whether or not you accept this view of Donald Kimball. It depends on whether or not you can accept the idea that Kimball was actually a murderer all along. And I don't know, it feels kind of weird. It feels strange to me. It feels weird to take Willem Dafoe's character and to be like, well, actually, he's an even bigger serial killer than Patrick Bateman. He kills so many more people. Because there's a really interesting fact about Willem Dafoe and shooting his scenes in the movie, where basically the director told him to shoot his scenes in 3 different ways. The director had him act out his scenes so that in one set of scenes, he had to act like he knew that Patrick Bateman was a killer. In another set of scenes, he had to act like he had no clue that Patrick Bateman was actually a killer. And then in the third set, he had to act like he was unsure and wasn't sure if Patrick Bateman was a killer and killed Paul Allen and all that good stuff. And so as a result, whenever Donald Kimball shows up in the movie, it's always very interesting because you don't know what exactly is going through his mind. You don't know how much of it he knows or actually believes or whatever. And so again, there's that ambiguity that the film and the book have, and the comic has none of it. And so whenever I say that it feels like the comic series doesn't understand the source material, basically what I mean is that it doesn't understand the larger themes of the novel. It doesn't understand the things that the movie and the book are trying to critique. It doesn't understand the dark comedy of the film. It doesn't understand the satire. And it reads like a very literal sequel, where it's like, okay, we're going to take these characters and we're going to jump forward 25 years or whatever, and we're just going to show what they're up to now. Despite the fact there are sections of the comic set in 2011, it doesn't really feel like that setting was utilized to its fullest. It does certainly feel like the comic is more interested in Kimball and Patrick Bateman in 1987 as opposed to Charlie, Patrick Bateman's daughter, in the year 2011. It feels like those two get a lot more screen time, and so as a result, Charlie is not the ideal protagonist simply because she doesn't have that much screen time. And honestly, her character arc doesn't really work too well, I feel. Because her character arc really is that she's a normal girl, and then she begins to question if she's a murderer, and then she finds out that her father is a murderer, and then she defends herself from a murderer, but like she doesn't ever do anything. Like she doesn't kill anyone, we as the readers know that she didn't kill anyone, and so really the comic series is just missing that ambiguity, and so as a result, Charlie is not as interesting as Patrick Bateman is in the original film and book. And so I think this comic series, the reason I wanted to talk about it is because it's so weird. Like, I do appreciate the fact that someone did take a stab at trying to make a sequel to American Psycho. I did stay up and read it all in one sitting because I did find it really interesting and gripping, but ultimately I don't think it comes together as it probably should have. There are a lot of things that are in the movie and in the book that I think that the sequel should have dealt with. I do think it would have been really interesting if the comic series addressed some of Patrick's, like, closeted homosexuality, I guess, because it feels like that could be one of the reasons why Patrick is essentially a psycho, basically, is because he's not in touch with his internal state, and it feels like tenderness and kindness scare him. Like, he does have sex with women, but he only pays attention to himself, and he poses in the mirror and that sort of thing. And so I think Patrick Bateman is a really interesting character for a multitude of reasons, but that is really the core of it, is that he doesn't understand himself. And so whenever certain characteristics come out that Patrick has tried to repress, that is when he feels most interesting as a character. But as I've said, the idea of an American Psycho sequel has been something that's been in my mind for a very long time. I would love a story of what Patrick Bateman is up to in this day and age. And it feels like, especially with Trump's second presidency having just begun, it feels like the time is better than ever for it, because again, Trump is a character in the original book, and he is someone who Patrick Bateman looks up to and admires and loves. And so it does kind of feel like I don't even need to say anything more than that. I mean, the guy who Patrick Bateman looked up to in the original book is literally the president. He's the most powerful man in the world. And so as a result, it feels like Patrick Bateman, this character, and it feels like this series, American Psycho, it feels like these are the perfect vehicles to be used for expressing what life is like right now. Things are weird, things are scary, and I think that Patrick Bateman could be a good source for explaining that. If there's ever a sequel to American Psycho, you know, if Bret Easton Ellis ever writes a sequel, or if someone makes a movie sequel, if Christian Bale ever comes back for a sequel, that would be awesome. But really what I would want to see, I think, is just, I would want to see Patrick Bateman made uncool. I think Patrick Bateman is a creep. I think he's a weirdo. I think he's gross. And I think that is the biggest thing that people don't get about it. I think that's the biggest misunderstanding with American Psycho. Patrick Bateman is not someone to be admired. He's not someone to be looked up to, because that's sort of the thing about him, is he's fake. He's a mask.
What do you like about Patrick Bateman?
What do I like?
Yeah.
I like nothing about him. I mean, he's a completely unredeeming character, you know, and I didn't attempt to make him sympathetic at all. But what makes him entertaining is the fact that
he has no redeeming value.
But that at the same time, he finds himself in so many ridiculous situations and reacts in such a ridiculous manner. You know, he's certainly somebody that I wouldn't want to, you know, be at a table with and eating, but I'd certainly want to eavesdrop on his conversation.
And so I think the book and the movie were criticizing, as I said, materialism, consumerism. I think they were also criticizing, like, bigotry and homophobia and racism and classism. There are all these things that Patrick Bateman expresses, you know, all these opinions about various groups and peoples. And really, he's just a scummy, terrible human being. And that's the point of American Psycho, is that he's a scumbag. And I feel like if I don't point this out, I'm going to get at least one comment that's like, why are you trying to make American Psycho political? But the The story is literally called American Psycho, and so, you know, it's been political from the start, especially if you consider the fact that both the movie and the book end with a speech from Ronald Reagan. It's always been a political series, so I say go all the way with it. But it feels like right now, at this point in time, there are so many horrific things, there are so many horrific behaviors that powerful people engage in. As I said, you have the Trump administration, you have all the crap with like P. Diddy and stuff like that. You have all these big tech billionaires who seem to be bowing down to Trump, but at the same time, I question if it's maybe the opposite. And so it feels like an American Psycho sequel should come out, basically. It's just that this wasn't the ideal one. And it makes me sad to say because there are some cool things about it. You can definitely tell that some thought went into it, and it's an interesting comic, but at the end of the day, it's not what I would have wanted. It's not the kind of intelligent, thoughtful story that I would have liked. Honestly, I think that the first Joker movie is like probably the closest thing to American Psycho that we've gotten. With that being said, I do think that the Joker movie is I don't think it's as smart as it thinks it is. I don't think it's as good as American Psycho. Absolutely not. But I do think it's interesting enough to where the two can be compared. And one last thing I did want to touch on is the fact that a comic book soundtrack, I guess, came out in support of the American Psycho series. For Christmas, I got this comic and I got the record that went along with it. It was a gift from my dad, so thank you, Dad. Basically, the soundtrack is mostly covers of 80s songs. A lot of the bands on here are more hard rock or alternative, but again, I kind of feel like that's one of those things where it's like the entire point of Patrick Bateman listening to pop music is that it's supposed to be like vapid. He's listening to pop music, I think, in large part due to the fact that it is popular and it's what everyone else likes. And so as a result, it does feel kind of weird to have like a sort of hard rock, alternative rock soundtrack to this. But at the same time, like there are some pretty good tracks. I like the cover of Miss Murder by Charlotte Sands. There's a cover of Depeche Mode's Dangerous by Perturbator, which I really like. Carpenter Brute's Eyes Without a Face is pretty good. There's a Pucifer song, and if you don't know who that is, it's James Maynard Keenan. It's the guy from Tool. And James Maynard Keenan did put out a Perfect Circle album a few years ago, and it had like some of the most obvious social commentary that I've heard. I think I'm thinking of the song So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, where he sings about like plastic surgery and social media and stuff like that. And then on this song, The Algorithm, he comes up with a pun. He comes off with, I think, social mediates, which is a combination of social media and idiot. And I've always felt that his social commentary, you know, feels about as rich or deep as Old Man Yelling at Cloud. So anyways, the soundtrack has some pretty good stuff on here. I do think it's weird that there are two different covers of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, and there are two different covers of Eyes Without a Face, because it kind of feels like, oh dang, you guys could only afford like 5 songs. Like, what's up with that? And then you open up the gatefold, and then it's just pictures from the movie. It does feel like too much of this comic, and even some of the covers and advertising for this comic, it feels like too much of it is like, hey, you remember American Psycho? You remember this movie? You like this cult classic? Well, we do too, so here are some scenes from it. It does feel like with this one, there was a real fear of like going off and doing something new. And so I think that's kind of the reason why the comic doesn't live up to my expectations. And then I guess I'll show you this. The disc for it is actually really freaking cool. I think I kind of have to stand back. But anyways, it's a really cool looking disc. But all in all, American Psycho is one of those series and franchises that is near and dear to my heart. It's not perfect, but I like a lot of things about it. I did buy a copy of the book recently to reread. So if you see a video where it's me talking about the actual book, don't be surprised. This entire comic kind of feels like a fever dream. It feels like something I would have dreamt up. And when I say that, I mean like literally, it feels so strange to be reading this because it's like, you know, like this is not the direction I would have gone in with an American Psycho sequel. But anyways, thank you, Dad, for the comic and record. I very much appreciate it because I did want to read this. And honestly, I didn't even realize that this series was finished. I had to look it up and it looks like there were large gaps between issues, and so I think the series lost a lot of steam because of it. Because I remember hearing people talk about the first couple issues, but then I never realized that they actually finished it. And it looks like it took about a year for them to come out with the entire series, which is only 5 issues. That could have killed some of the momentum for it. And so anyways, if you've read the comic, I would be really interested in hearing your take on it. Because again, I think it's an interesting take. I don't think it's the ideal one. I don't think it's the best one. And so anyways, this is what I got. I'm looking at my notes and this is what I got. So thank you for watching. Have a nice night and goodbye.